Disclaimer: all content in this video was created with the assistance of artificial intelligence AI. The information, visuals, and narration presented are AI generated and may not fully represent historical accuracy. This video is intended for educational, entertainment, and creative purposes only. Viewers are encouraged to conduct additional research from reliable sources for factual information. The history of Rome begins in the shadow of legend. Before the Republic and the Empire, before consuls and Caesars, the city was ruled by kings. Their reigns are preserved in stories half remembered, shaped as much by myth as by fact. Yet behind these traditions lies the outline of real rulers who guided a small Latin settlement on the banks of the Tiber into the beginnings of greatness. Among these early monarchs, the name of Ancus Marcius stands out. As the fourth king of Rome, reigning in the mid-7th century BC, he inherited a city already transformed by its predecessors. Romulus had founded it. Numa Pompilius, his own grandfather, had sanctified it with religion and law. Tullus Hostilius had enlarged it by force of arms. To Ancus fell the task of reconciling these legacies, to restore piety where it had been neglected, to expand territory where it was threatened, and to secure Rome's foundations for the generations to come. The traditions surrounding Ancus present him as a ruler of balance. He was at once a warrior and a priest, a conqueror and a builder, a man who understood that Rome's future depended not only on victory but on incorporation, not only on conquest but on stability. His reign was marked by both war and diplomacy, by the founding of colonies and the construction of institutions, by the expansion of Rome's walls and the restoration of its rights. This video tells the story of Ancus Marcius as the Romans themselves remembered him. It traces the arc of his reign, from the state of Rome before his accession to the institutions he left behind. It explores how he was portrayed in later history as a just king, a restorer of religion, builder of the city, and a model of moderation. In doing so, it sheds light not only on a single monarch but on the values and priorities of early Rome. The reign of Ancus is more than a chapter in the story of the kings. It is a window into the formative period of Roman civilization, when the city was still defining itself. His policies of conquest and incorporation foreshadowed the strategies Rome would later employ across Italy and the Mediterranean. His insistence on sacred law and matters of war reflected the Roman conviction that power must be clothed in legitimacy. His building projects laid the groundwork for the city's future growth. To study Ancus Marcius is to see Rome at a critical moment, no longer a fragile settlement, not yet the empire of the Caesars, but a city in the making, carving out its identity through law, war, religion, and integration. His legacy reminds us that the greatness of Rome was not the work of founders and conquerors alone, but also of those who secured, strengthened, and balanced what had already been won. It is to that legacy that we now turn. Chapter 1: Rome before Ancus. When Ancus Marcius ascended the throne of Rome, the city was still young, barely a century old by tradition. Its kings were remembered less as distant rulers and more as founders, each shaping Rome's character in different ways. To understand Ancus, we first need to understand what came before him. From shepherds to a city of kings according to legend, Rome began in 753 BCE with Romulus, a warrior founder. He carved out a city on the Palatine Hill, filled it with shepherds and exiles, and bound them together with laws and walls. Romulus's reign was bloody and ambitious. He secured wives for his men through the famous rape of the Sabine women, fought neighboring peoples, and expanded Rome's land. His Rome was a city of soldiers driven by survival and conquest. For Romulus's mysterious death, some say he was taken up to the heavens to become the god Quirinus. Rome turned to a very different figure. The peace of Numa Pompilius. Rome's second king, Numa Pompilius, was the opposite of Romulus. Where Romulus had built through war, Numa ruled through peace. He was remembered as a deeply religious man, a lawgiver, and a reformer who gave Rome its religious backbone. Numa was credited with creating many priestly offices, temples, and sacred rituals that would guide Rome for centuries. Numa gave the Romans something Romulus never had: stability. If Romulus had forged the sword of Rome, Numa gave it the spirit. The ferocity of Tullus Hostilius' pendulum swung back with the third king, Tullus Hostilius, a man who embodied the fiery, warlike spirit of Romulus. Tullus was aggressive, expanding Rome's power through battles with the Alba Longa, the Sabines, and other neighbors. The most famous tale of his reign was the duel of the Horatian Curiaci, where sets of triplet brothers fought on behalf of Rome and Alba Longa to decide the fate of their cities. Rome triumphed, Alba Longa was destroyed. Its people absorbed into Rome, yet Tullus' disregard for the gods earned him a grim fate. According to legend, he neglected Rome's sacred rites, and when he finally tried to perform a great sacrifice, Jupiter struck him dead with a lightning bolt. His reign ended in fire, reminding Rome of the danger of ignoring the divine. Rome Ancus inherited by the time Ancus Marcius came to power in 642 BCE. Rome was already a city of contradictions. It was both a place of warriors and of priests, a city that grew by conquest but was bound together by ritual and law. Ancus would inherit a people who had seen both extremes, the restless energy of war and the quiet stability of peace. His task would be to balance them. Chapter 2, The Man Behind the Crown *, a king with two inheritances. The figure of Ancus Marcius sits at a crossroads of Roman identity. Tradition names him the grandson of Numa Pompilius, Rome's second king. If true, this ancestry was no small matter. Numa was remembered not only as the lawgiver and peacemaker, but also as the spiritual father of Roman religion. To claim descent from him was to claim a legacy of wisdom, piety, and order. Yet Ancus also inherited a Rome reshaped by Tullus Hostilius, the warlike king who preceded him. Tullus had expanded Rome's territory, destroyed Alba Longa, and folded its citizens into Roman society. He had left behind a stronger city, but one with fraying religious foundations. Ancus Marcius' challenge would be to unite these two inheritances, the piety of Numa and the martial vigor of Romulus and Tullus, and shape them into a balanced kingship. Origins and lineage sources are fragmentary, but most Roman historians, Livy, Dionysius of Halicarnassus, and Plutarch, repeat the tradition that Ancus was born into a distinguished Roman family, tied to Numa's bloodline. Some accounts say his mother was Numa's daughter. This connection mattered deeply in Rome, where ancestry was not merely pride but legitimacy. From Numa, Ancus was said to have inherited his religious devotion. Ancient writers often described him as pious but not passive, a man who honored the gods but also understood the necessity of war. His surname, Marcius, is significant too. It linked him to the god Mars, patron of war. Thus, in his very name, Ancus carried the dual themes of Roman life, war, and religion. Rome's expectations after Tullus, when Tullus Hostilius was struck down, supposedly by a lightning bolt for performing sacred rites. Incorrectly, the Romans turned to Ancus with high expectations. They wanted a king who could restore the favor of the gods without sacrificing military strength. Ancus was not chosen hastily. Rome's monarchy was not hereditary but elective. The Senate first nominated him, and then the Roman people formally approved. His connection to Numa likely made him a candidate who could calm the unease that followed Tullus's fiery end. This election also tells us something about early Roman values. The people sought a leader who embodied both continuity and correction. They did not want another reckless warmonger, or did they desire a ruler who would abandon Rome's military gains? Character and reputation. Later Roman writers shaped Ancus's character into that of the just king. Livy tells us that he carefully revived the sacred rites that Tullus had neglected. At the same time, he did not let Rome grow soft. He was portrayed as a man who valued justice in war, a trait symbolized by his reliance on the officials, the priests responsible for declaring war properly and negotiating peace. This detail is telling. Rome, even in its infancy, wanted its wars to appear lawful and sanctioned by the gods. Ancus, then his predecessors, institutionalized that principle. He believed war was sometimes necessary, but never without divine approval and legal justification. Such qualities made him a king Romans later remembered with respect, neither a tyrant nor a weakling, but a model of balance. Rome in his tomato imagined the man. We must picture the Rome he ruled. By 642 BCE, the city was expanding physically, absorbing Alba Longa's people, settling newly conquered lands, growing socially, a mixed population of Romans, Sabines, Latins, and others, economically emerging, controlling salt routes along the Tiber, the lifeblood of trade. Religiously strained, rituals neglected under Tullus needed restoration to keep Rome in divine favor. Ancus was stepping into the throne at a critical moment. Rome was no longer a fragile cluster of huts, but it was not yet the empire it would one day become. It needed a king who could guide it through consolidation, not just survival. Early actions as king, one of Ancus's first recorded actions was to order the sacred rites of war and peace to be written down. Previously, much of Roman ritual had been passed orally or left to memory. By codifying the process, Ancus ensured that Rome's wars would be justified and repeatable by tradition. This act shows not only his piety but also his practical nature. He recognized that Rome was becoming too large and too complex to rely on informal customs. The city needed structure, law, and a sense of divine sanction behind its ambitions. Chapter 3: The Reign of Ancus Marcius. When Ancus Marcius ascended the throne of Rome in 642 BCE, he inherited a city that was larger, stronger, and more complicated than it had ever been before. His reign was remembered as one of balance. He was not merely a warrior nor merely a priest, but a king who combined both. In his time, Rome expanded its territory, consolidated its institutions, and began to take its first steps toward becoming not just a hilltop town, but a regional power. The justification of one of Ancus's most lasting contributions was his revival of the sacred rites connected to the declaration of war. During the reign of Tullus Hostilius, religious practice had fallen into neglect. Romans believed Tullus had been punished for this irreverence. When a lightning bolt destroyed his palace, Ancus, the grandson of Numa Pompilius, moved quickly. To correct the lapse, he ordered the rites of the officials to be carefully observed and written down. The officials were priests who ensured that wars were properly declared and sanctioned by the gods. Before war could be undertaken, the Romans first demanded restitution for wrongs. Only when the enemy refused, and only after prayers and sacrifices, did the priests declare that the gods approved of war. This practice was not simply religious. It provided Rome with a moral justification for expansion by requiring formal procedures. Ancus established the principle that Rome never waged aggressive war. It always fought to avenge wrongs or to defend its people. Whether or not this was true in practice, the claim itself became a cornerstone of Roman identity. Wars against the Latins. First major conflict of Ancus's reign came against the Latins, Rome's neighbors in central Italy. Tensions had been mounting since the destruction of Alba Longa under Tullus. Some Latin towns viewed Rome's growing power with suspicion, while others sought to test the new king. Ancus responded firmly. By performing the rites of the officials, he declared war and led Rome's armies into the field. Several towns fell to him, including Politorium, Telene, and Vicana. Ancus's policy toward the conquered was consistent with Rome's earlier practice, but carried further. Rather than destroying these towns, he resettled their populations in Rome itself. Ventimiglia became home to many of these newcomers. By integrating them into the city, Ancus expanded Rome's citizen body and ensured that conquered peoples became Romans rather than perpetual enemies. This approach would later define Rome's rise. Victory followed not only by conquest, but by incorporation. Ancus strengthened the city by making its enemies part of it. Founding of Ostia. Among all of Ancus's achievements, none proved more important for Rome's long-term future than the foundation of Ostia, a settlement at the mouth of the Tiber River. The Tiber had always been vital for Rome, providing a route for trade and communication with the sea. By establishing Ostia, Ancus gave Rome its first seaport. The new colony secured control of the nearby salt pans, a critical economic resource, and provided a base for protecting the river and coastline. Ostia also marked Rome's first step toward maritime activity, though Rome would not become a naval power for centuries. Foundation of Ostia revealed an awareness of the importance of controlling access to the sea. Archaeological remains at Ostia suggest the existence of fortifications and salt warehouses dating to this early period, confirming the city's dual role as an economic and defensive outpost. Bridges, walls, and infrastructure. Ian's reign is also remembered for major building projects within Rome itself. Ancient tradition credits him with the construction of the Pons Sublicius, first bridge over the Tiber. Built of wood, the bridge allowed the Romans to cross easily into a territory on the western bank. Until this point, the river had served as a boundary. Under Ancus, it became a channel of connection. The bridge also carried religious significance. Its wooden structure required regular ritual maintenance, ensuring that even a practical work, engineering remained integrated into Rome's sacred traditions. Ancus also strengthened the city's defenses, the Rome's population swelling due to the settlement of conquered peoples. New fortifications were necessary. He extended the city's walls and is credited with building the Carcer, Rome's first prison at the edge of the Forum. This edition reflected his concern with order and the rule of law, a theme consistent with his revival of religious and legal rights. Expansion across the Tiber for much of early Roman history. The city was confined to the eastern bank of the Tiber. Ancus was first to establish significant settlements on the Janiculum Hill across the river. The Janiculum provided a strategic vantage point, guarding the western approaches to the city. By fortifying the hill and linking it to Rome via the Pons Sublicius, Ancus ensured that Rome was no longer bounded by the Tiber. This expansion symbolized Rome's growing ambition. It was no longer a single hilltop settlement, but a city straddling the river, positioned to dominate Latium. That growing and diverse population, the incorporation of conquered peoples into Rome under Ancus, led to rapid demographic change. The Aventine Hill, in particular, became a settlement area for Latins brought into the city. Over time, this district developed its own character, often associated with Rome's plebeian population. This policy of integration helped Rome grow, but also created new social tensions. The presence of diverse peoples with different customs and traditions required a unifying framework. Ancus's attention to religion and law was essential here. Shared rituals and institutions gave Romans, old and new, a common identity, the model. But balanced King Ancus's reign was remembered as a middle course between his predecessors. Romulus and Tullus had embodied war, Numa had embodied peace. Ancus combined both. He fought wars, but only with justification. He built institutions, but without neglecting the city's military strength. This balance made him a model in Roman tradition. He was not remembered as a founder or a conqueror on the scale of Romulus, or as a religious visionary like Numa, but he was respected as a just king, one who consolidated and secured the city for future growth. Enduring contributions. Legacy of Ancus Marcius was not only in his conquests but in the structures and institutions he left behind. The Fetials provided a framework for Rome's conduct of war that endured for centuries. Ostia became Rome's permanent link to the sea and later one of the most important ports. The empire. The Pons Sublicius remained central to Roman identity. Both practical and sacred, the Aventine Hill grew into a populous district, a center of plebeian life in the Republic. Their fortifications and the Carcer symbolized Rome's growth into a true city-state. With order and law through these measures, Ancus gave Rome the infrastructure and institutions it needed to evolve from a collection of settlements into a durable power. Chapter 4. Laws, Religion. And Society. Ancus Marcius was remembered for military expansion and monumental construction. He was also remembered as a king who reinforced the moral and religious foundations of the Roman people. His reign revealed a deep understanding of Rome's identity, a city that could conquer its neighbors only if it first held the favor of the gods and the loyalty of its citizens. Restoring the sacred right zone of Ancus's earliest acts as king was to revive and codify religious practices that had fallen into neglect under Tullus Hostilius. Romans believed that Tullus's irreverence had cost him his life. Struck down by Jupiter for performing a sacrifice improperly, Ancus, as the descendant of Numa Pompilius, was determined not to repeat the mistake. He ordered the rites of war and peace to be committed to writing and preserved by the priests. This was an important development. In earlier generations, religious ceremonies had been passed down orally, dependent on memory and custom. By recording them, Ancus created a safeguard against neglect or error. Religion in Rome was not a matter of private belief but a public duty. Every ritual had to be performed precisely, for the gods demanded exactness. Mistakes in sacrifice or prayer could invalidate the ceremony, leaving the city vulnerable to divine anger. By systematizing the rites, Ancus ensured that Rome's growing population would remain united under shared traditions, and that the gods' favor would be maintained as the city expanded. The Fetials and the justice of religion for Ancus was never separate from politics. His revival of the Fetials, priests tasked with overseeing declarations of war and treaties, gave Rome a religious framework for its foreign policy. The officials embodied a principle that became central to Roman ideology that Rome never waged war unjustly whenever Rome's allies or citizens were wronged. The priests demanded redress from the offending city. Only when the demand was refused did they declare war, hurling a spear into enemy territory to mark the beginning of conflict. This ritual gave Roman wars the aura of legality and divine sanction. It allowed the Romans to present themselves both to themselves and to others as a people who fought only when wronged. In practice, this often served as a justification for expansion, but the importance of the ritual cannot be overstated. It transformed warfare from an act of aggression into a sacred duty linking religion, law, and politics into one system. Law and social order. Ancus was also credited with measures that reinforced legal order in Rome. Sources suggest that he took steps to ensure the fair application of justice, although the details are scarce. His construction of the carcer, Rome's first prison near the Forum, symbolized this concern. Prison was more than a holding place for criminals. It represented the king's authority to maintain order, to enforce laws, and to punish wrongdoing. Its presence in the Forum, at the heart of civic life, underscored the idea that Rome was not simply a collection of warriors and settlers, but a community bound together by rules and accountability. These developments foreshadowed the Roman Republic's later obsession with law even in the monarchy. The idea of a legal framework, distinct from the personal will of the king, was beginning to take shape. Ancus's codification of rituals and his concern for justice contributed to this trajectory. Religion as a unifying force. Rome in the mid-7th century BCE was not a homogeneous city. Its population had been swelled by the resettlement of conquered Latins and Albans. Different groups, each with their own customs and traditions, lived within the city's walls. Religion was the glue that held them together, by restoring sacred rites and reinforcing the city's collective worship. Ancus gave these diverse peoples a shared identity. Festivals, sacrifices, and processions were occasions where all Romans, old families and new arrivals alike, participated in the same rituals. This was especially important in a society where political representation was still limited and the monarchy dominated civic life. Religion provided the common ground that politics could not. In this sense, Ancus's work as a religious restorer was not only about pleasing the gods, but about binding Rome's citizens into one community. Balancing tradition and change. Ancus's approach to law and religion reveals his talent for balance. He did not innovate recklessly. Instead, he preserved and codified traditions inherited from Numa. At the same time, he adapted them to a changing Rome. Written records, formalized priestly procedures, and the construction of civic institutions reflected the needs of a growing city. His reign demonstrates how early Rome understood progress, not as the invention of something entirely new, but as the careful adaptation of tradition to meet new circumstances. This conservative yet flexible approach became a hallmark of Roman governance for centuries. The king as lawgiver and priest in Ancus's time. The king was both a political leader and a high priest. This dual role gave him immense authority, but also immense responsibility. Unlike in the later Republic and Empire, there was no division between civil and religious law. To govern Rome was to govern its relationship with the gods. Ancus embodied this union. His actions reveal a ruler deeply conscious that military strength and civic order depended on divine favor. By ensuring the gods were honored, by establishing justice, and by binding his people through shared rituals, he gave Rome the stability it needed to grow. Chapter 5. Building a legacy. The reign of Ancus Marcius was remembered not only for wars and laws, but for the physical transformation of Rome. Under his rule, the city expanded beyond its old limits. New infrastructure took shape, and colonies were founded that would secure Rome's position in Latium for centuries. Ancus's legacy was as much material as political. He gave Rome the bridges, walls, ports, and institutions that allowed it to become a durable power. The Pons Sublicius. Among the most celebrated achievements of Ancus was the construction of the Pons Sublicius, Rome's first bridge across the Tiber, built entirely of wood. Without the use of iron, the bridge was more than a feat of engineering. It was a statement of Rome's growing strength. Before its construction, the Tiber had been a natural boundary. Crossing it required ferries, limiting movement and leaving the western bank outside the city's reach. Pompilius changed that by linking the Forum Boreum Rome's cattle market to the Janiculum Hill on the far side of the river. The bridge gave Rome direct access to new territory. The bridge also carried symbolic weight. Romans regarded the Tiber as a sacred river, and any structure built upon it required ritual care. Pompilius was maintained under religious supervision. Its purely wooden construction reflected a desire to keep it ritually pure. Later generations would see it as both a practical lifeline and a sacred monument of Rome's earliest kings. Expansion to the Janiculum. With the bridge came expansion. Ancus established a settlement on the Janiculum Hill, securing the high ground. On the western bank, this position gave Rome a defensive advantage, protecting the city from attack by the Etruscans across the river. The fortification of the Janiculum marked a turning point. Rome was no longer confined to a cluster of hills on the east bank. The city had begun to stretch beyond its original boundaries, straddling the Tiber and projecting its influence outward. The control of both sides of the river also strengthened Rome's hold over trade, ensuring that the Tiber remained firmly under Roman authority. The foundation of Ostia, perhaps Ancus's most enduring foundation, was the establishment of Ostia at the mouth of the Tiber. This new colony served multiple purposes. Economically, it secured control of the salt pans, one of Latium's most valuable resources. Salt was essential not only for preserving food, but also for trade. By controlling its supply, Rome strengthened its wealth and influence strategically. Ostia provided a permanent base at the river's mouth. It protected Rome's access to the sea and served as a bulwark against incursions from hostile powers along the coast. In time, Ostia would grow into Rome's principal port, feeding the capital with grain and goods from across the Mediterranean. Though its greatest importance lay in the future, its foundation by Ancus was a crucial step in Rome's rise. Urban expansion and the Aventini Hill as Rome's population swelled. With the resettlement of conquered Latins, the city required new space. Ancus settled many of these newcomers on the Aventini Hill, which became an important district in Roman life. The Aventini had long been associated with outsiders, and later came to be linked with the plebeians, Rome's common citizens. By establishing conquered peoples there, Ancus both expanded the city's territory and created a space that embodied Rome's policy of incorporation. Rather than excluding or enslaving the defeated, he made them Romans, giving them a stake in the city's future. This expansion also required new defenses. Ancus extended Rome's walls to encompass the Aventini, ensuring that the enlarged population was protected within the cities. Fortifications. The walls symbolized Rome's transformation from a cluster of villages into a true urban center. Economic consolidation and building projects were not only military or defensive, they were also economic. Control of the Tiber through the Pompilius, control of the Janiculum for defense, and control of Ostia for salt and trade together gave Rome a secure economic base. The salt pans at Ostia were particularly valuable. Salt was one of the few commodities universally needed. Rome's position allowed it to dominate the salt trade in central Italy. Some traditions suggest that the ancient Via Salaria, the salt road which carried salt inland, was systematized under Ancus's reign. By securing these resources, Ancus gave Rome the economic foundation necessary for sustained growth. Later kings and the Republic itself would build upon this base, but it was Ancus who first consolidated Rome's hold over both the river and sea. The Carcer and the rule of law. Another element of Ancus's legacy was the construction of the Carcer, the prison at the edge of the Forum. While small in scale compared to later buildings, the prison symbolized the growing complexity of Roman society. With a larger population came greater need for order. The Carcer was not merely a place of confinement. It was a visible reminder of the king's authority and of the rule of law in the heart of Rome. Situated at the center of civic life, it underscored the idea that justice was integral to the community, a consolidator, not a founder. Ancus's building program reveals the character of his reign. He was not a founder in the mold of Romulus, nor a conqueror like Tullus Hostilius, nor a lawgiver of Numa's type. Instead, he was a consolidator. He took the achievements of his predecessors, territory gained, religious practices established, population expanded, and gave them durable form. The bridge, colony, the walls, the salt pans, and the prison were not mere monuments, they were the infrastructure of a growing state. They reflected an understanding that Rome's greatness would not rest on war alone, but on secure institutions, resources, and civic life. Chapter 6, War and Diplomacy. Though Ancus Marcius is remembered as a king of balance and consolidation, his reign was far from peaceful. Rome in the 7th century BCE could not survive without constant vigilance. War remained a central feature of its politics. Yet Ancus approached warfare differently from his predecessors. Where Tullus Hostilius gloried in aggression, Ancus sought to frame conflict within the boundaries of law and religion. His wars were not only campaigns of conquest but also exercises in diplomacy, ritual, and integration. Context of Latium. Rome's neighbors in Latium were a patchwork of small towns and tribes, each competing for resources and influence. The Albans had been destroyed under Tullus, but their former allies and rivals, the Latins, remained. Control of the Tiber and the salt trade made Rome both a target and a threat. In this environment, wars were frequent, but they were rarely wars of annihilation. Instead, they were contests for territory, prestige, and security. Rome's survival depended on the ability of its kings to navigate this unstable landscape, and Ancus proved adept at doing so. The revival of the official lesson. True to Ancus's approach was the revival of the official law of war. The priests of the officials played a critical role in ensuring that Rome's wars were not seen as acts of aggression but as responses to injustice. When a neighboring city wronged Rome, whether by seizing territory, attacking allies, or refusing restitution, the officials would be dispatched. They demanded satisfaction, and if this was refused, they performed the solemn ritual of declaring war. A spear, tipped with iron and dipped in blood, was hurled into enemy territory as a sign that Rome's cause was just and sanctioned by the gods. This ritual may appear symbolic, but it carried profound political weight by presenting its wars as defensive and divinely sanctioned. Rome justified its expansion and strengthened its moral authority. Ancus ensured that Rome's military campaigns were not simply the will of a king, but the expression of a community acting under sacred law. Campaigns against the Latins. The main conflicts of Ancus's reign were with the Latins, who threatened Roman territory and trade routes. According to tradition, the Latins violated treaties and encroached on Roman lands, provoking Rome to act. Ancus's response was swift and decisive. With the authority of the officials behind him, he led Roman forces into Latin territory. Several towns were captured, their inhabitants brought to Rome. Rather than destroying these communities, Ancus resettled their populations on the Aventine Hill, incorporating them into the Roman state. This policy of incorporation distinguished Ancus from many of his contemporaries. Instead of scattering the conquered or reducing them to slaves, he made them Romans. The Aventini became a symbol of Rome's willingness to absorb outsiders and transform them into citizens. This practice, repeated in later centuries, would become one of the secrets of Rome's expansion. Enemies defeated on the battlefield could become allies within the city. Diplomacy through colonization was not Rome's only weapon. Colonization was also a tool of diplomacy and control. Most famous example was the founding of Ostia at the Tiber's mouth. Ostia not only secured the salt pans and safeguarded Rome's access to the sea, but also projected Roman power into coastal Latium. By establishing colonies, Ancus created permanent footholds in contested regions. These settlements were both military outposts and symbols of Roman presence. They reminded neighboring peoples that Rome was not a transient power, but a growing state capable of holding and organizing territory. Balancing force and incorporation pattern of Ancus's wars reveals a consistent strategy. He combined military force with diplomatic incorporation, ensuring that Rome's victories strengthened the city rather than overstretching it. Defeated towns were not annihilated but resettled. Captured populations were absorbed as Romans, swelling the citizen body. Colonies were established not just as garrisons but as centers of trade and influence. This approach reflects Ancus's larger philosophy of rule. He understood that Rome's strength lay not in destruction but in growth. Each war brought new people, new resources, and new territory into the Roman fold. The reputation of Ancus's wars letter historians, including Livy, contrasted Ancus with his predecessor Tullus, where Tullus sought glory through unrestrained aggression. Ancus was careful and deliberate, waging war only when justified by law and necessity. This gave him a reputation as a just king whose campaigns were righteous and measured. Yet the results of his wars were no less significant. Rome's territory expanded, its population grew, and its economic base was secured. By the end of his reign, Rome was stronger, richer, and more deeply rooted in Latium than it had ever been before. Chapter 7, Ancus in Memory and Tradition. The kings of early Rome lived half in history and half in legend. Written records were scarce in their time, and most of what later generations knew of them came from oral traditions, family memories, and the interpretations of historians like Livy and Dionysius of Halicarnassus. Within this framework, Ancus Marcius occupied a distinctive place. He was remembered not as a founder or a conqueror, but as a restorer, a builder, and a just king. His reign symbolized the balance between tradition and growth that became a hallmark of Rome itself. The shadow of Numa Pompilius, the memory of Ancus, was inseparable from that of his grandfather, Numa Pompilius, Rome's second king. Numa had been the model of piety and law, a king who established Rome's religious rites and gave the city its moral foundation. Ancus's identity was shaped by this heritage. Later Romans described him as Numa Nepos, the grandson of Numa, highlighting his role as an inheritor of sacred tradition. This lineage gave his reign a particular character. He was expected to restore and preserve what had been neglected by his predecessor Tullus Hostius in Roman memory. Ancus fulfilled this duty. He was seen as the king who brought religion and law back to their proper place, balancing the aggression of Tullus with a return to order. His connection to Numa ensured that he was remembered less for military glory than for piety and stability. The just king Ancus was often contrasted with Tullus Hostilius in the sources. Where Tullus was rash and warlike, Ancus was careful and deliberate. Where Tullus neglected the gods, Ancus honored them. Livy in particular emphasized this contrast, portraying Ancus as the king who codified sacred rites and restored the official law of war. To later Romans, this made him the model of a just ruler, one who combined military necessity with religious scruple, ensuring that Rome's wars were not reckless but righteous. This reputation was important for the Roman self-image. As Rome expanded across Italy and beyond, it liked to see itself not as an aggressor but as a defender of justice. Ancus, with his careful rituals of war and his policy of incorporating conquered peoples, embodied this ideal in its earliest form. Builder of Rome. Another enduring aspect of Ancus's memory was his role as a builder. He was remembered as the king who gave Rome its first bridge, its first prison, and its first seaport. These works were not remembered as mere utilities, but as symbols of growth. Pons Sublicius represented Rome's mastery of the Tiber. Ostia represented Rome's first step toward the sea. The walls and settlements represented the transformation of Rome from a village to a city. Later Romans, proud of their city's grandeur, traced its foundations back to Ancus's projects, seeing in him the monarch who had laid the groundwork for future greatness. Rome, the integrator of the most distinctive features of Ancus's reign and memory, was his policy of incorporation. The settlement of conquered Latins on the Aventini Hill was seen as a precedent for Rome's later capacity to absorb outsiders. This theme resonated deeply in Roman tradition. Unlike many ancient states, which excluded or enslaved the conquered, Rome often found ways to make them part of the community. Ancus was remembered as one of the first kings to embody this principle, enlarging Rome not only through conquest but through integration. In the Roman imagination, this made him a model of wisdom. He understood that Rome's strength came not only from arms but from people, the ability to turn former enemies into citizens and contributors to Rome's success. The balance of tradition and innovation in the sequence of Rome's kings. Ancus was remembered as the figure of balance. Romulus founded the city. Numa gave it religion and law. Tullus expanded it through war. Ancus combined all these elements, restoring Numa's piety, pursuing Tullus's conquests, and consolidating Romulus's foundation. This balance made him a transitional figure, linking the early kings to the later ones. He was not remembered for extremes but for moderation, a quality that Romans valued as the secret of their endurance. Later Roman reflections be the time of the late Republic, when Livy and Dionysius were writing. Ancus Marcius had become more symbol than man. Few concrete details of his reign were remembered, but the traditions attached to him reflected Roman values. He was the pious king, recalling the sanctity of Numa. He was the just king, waging lawful wars through the officials. He was the builder, king who gave Rome lasting institutions. He was the integrator, who enlarged the citizen body and set the precedent for Rome's inclusive policy. These qualities made him a touchstone for Roman identity. In an age when Rome ruled the Mediterranean, looking back on its humble beginnings, Ancus represented the virtues that explained the city's rise: piety, justice, strength, and inclusiveness. Chapter 8, Conclusion, the end of Ancus's reign and his legacy among the kings. Ancus Marcius reigned for 24 years, and by the time of his death, Rome had been transformed. The city was larger, stronger, and more secure than at any time since its founding. Its walls encompassed new districts, its bridge spanned the Tiber, its first seaport linked it to the sea. Its population had swelled with the incorporation of conquered peoples. Ancus left behind not only a city fortified and expanded, but also institutions that gave structure to Roman life. Yet like all the kings of Rome, his reign eventually gave way to succession. In Roman tradition, it was during the interregnum following Ancus's death that Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, a man of Etruscan origin, came to power. Tarquinius, ambitious and energetic, presented a new phase in Roman history: the gradual shift from Latin and Sabine kingship to Etruscan influence, with its greater emphasis on splendor, monarchy, and power. The contrast was striking. Ancus had been the consolidator, the moderate ruler who preserved balance. Tarquinius would be the innovator and empire builder, inaugurating a line of kings who transformed Rome into something far grander but also more unstable. In this way, Ancus's reign served as a pivot between the age of the city's foundational kings and the age of its ambitious monarchs. The legacy of balance signed the traditional order of Rome's kings. Ancus stood as the embodiment of balance. Romulus founded the city by force and will. Numa gave it religion and law. Tullus expanded it through arms. Ancus combined all three, restoring piety, codifying law, waging just wars, and consolidating conquest with colonization. Later historians, keen to show that Rome's greatness derived from a mixture of qualities, placed Ancus in this essential role. He was the king who embodied the Roman ideal of temperantia, moderation, balance, and prudence. Institutions that endure. The enduring memory of Ancus lay in the institutions and structures he left behind. The Pons Sublicious became not only a bridge but a symbol of Rome's dominion over the Tiber. The Janiculum settlement secured the western bank and extended Rome's sphere. Colony of Ostia gave Rome its first connection to the sea and its control of the salt trade. The crusher symbolized law and authority at the city's heart. The extension of the walls and settlement of the Aventini turned Rome into a larger, more integrated city. These were not temporary achievements, but foundations upon which later rulers, kings, consuls, and emperors would build. Even centuries later, Romans could point to these works as monuments of Ancus's foresight. The model of just war weakly enduring was his revival of the official rites of war. By embedding warfare within law and religion, Ancus gave Rome a moral framework for expansion. Rome's later claimed that it fought only just wars. It was always defending itself against aggression, found one of its earliest expressions in Ancus's reign. While this was partly ideology, it was also effective politics. By framing conquest as defense, Rome strengthened its legitimacy and bound its growth to divine sanction. Ancus thus contributed not only to Rome's territory but to its identity, memory, and the Roman imagination. In the Roman imagination, Ancus was less vivid than Romulus the founder, less sanctified than Numa the priest, less dramatic than Tullus the warrior, and less splendid than Tarquinius the builder of temples. Yet this very moderation gave him a secure place in tradition. He was the king of quiet strength, remembered for his careful balance of war and peace, religion and law, tradition and innovation. Later Romans, looking back on their cities' rise, saw in Ancus the embodiment of the qualities that allowed Rome to grow steadily without losing its foundation. Conclusion, a lasting legacy. The reign of Ancus Marcius marked the end of one phase of Roman monarchy and the beginning of another. With him, the line of kings tied to Numa came to a close, and the way was open for new rulers of foreign origin and greater ambition. But the groundwork Ancus had laid endured. He left Rome stronger, more expansive, and more stable than he had founded his balance of religion and war, his incorporation of conquered peoples, his works of infrastructure and colonization. All these became enduring features of Roman policy. Identity died in the long sequence of Rome's history. Ancus was not remembered as a king of brilliance or legend, but as one of substance. His reign proved that moderation could be as powerful as ambition, that consolidation could be as enduring as conquest, and that the quiet work of building institutions could prepare the way for centuries of greatness died in the memory of Rome. Ancus Marcius stood as a reminder that empires are not built only by founders and conquerors, but also by those who strengthen foundations, secure borders, and weave tradition into enduring practice. His legacy, though less dramatic than others, was no less essential to the making of Rome.